And we are recording and streaming with Dr. Peter McCullough on Monday, August 4th, 2025 at 11:04 a.m. Eastern Time to discuss your new books, Vaccines, Mythology, Ideology, and Reality. And I will jump into there it is. You can get it online. The link to it's in the description on Amazon. I believe it's already a #1 bestseller. I will get into it in a second, and because you read my mind when I was reading it towards the end of it, I was just thinking, I was like, all right, how would I wrap this up? And then you wrapped it up in a bow, and I'll just continue with this line of thought was you pointed out early in the book, the idea that just because people are against the mRNA vaccine in no way, shape, or form means they're necessarily against every vaccine. And that argument is a straw man used to paint everybody who doesn't want the mRNA shot as a quack. And the entire book is about the corruption and then the uses and then the unuses of it. And when I was thinking about it is about the time it came up in the book was everyone knows you have to have a military. You have to, it doesn't matter how much of a tree hugger you are, you have to have some form of military, tanks, soldiers, whatever. But you also know that there are people who will use that argument, you got to keep you safe, to do atrocities and financial devastation around the world, which we've seen with the military industrial complex. Just because you question it doesn't mean you want the whole thing dissolved. But that is, I think it was that Goering who said, or I think it was Goering who said, yeah, denounce them as pacifists. If they're against what we do, denounce them as pacifists. And I think that's the best possible way to frame what I believe you were trying to put into the book is questioning the newest one in all of its new forms and unprecedented measures does not mean you're against the long history and use of vaccines and public health over, the last 200 years. But of course, the people that are trying to paint someone as that are doing it disingenuously. So that's my opening thoughts on the book. Dr. McCullough.
Well, Tommy, thank you so much for having me on the program. Because your viewers are expanding so, you know, exponentially every week. I'm Dr. Peter McCullough. I'm in practice as an internist and cardiologist in Dallas, Texas. I'm actually in the McCullough Foundation studios here in Dallas. So I've really taken an upgrade, no longer in a front office and of my house or my prior clinical office. So at McCullough Foundation, we now have a studio. I've certainly have my clinical operations here. And yeah, I've been in practice for decades, Tommy. I took all the vaccines. My kids took all the vaccines. And you're right, this pejorative of being an anti-vaxxer is in a sense a way to try to smear somebody. We shouldn't try to smear somebody over an antibiotic or an antihypertensive or a lipid-lowering drug or a vaccine. But the question is, why would somebody want to smear another person? And that gets into what we call vaccine ideology.
And that does seem to be kind of the shifting point. And I think it's important for you to point out, or as you did point out about, I forget what year it was in the 1970s, the influenza outbreak and how they thought there was the next big one coming. And the last big one at that time was 1918.
Mhm.
And how they rolled this thing out, they're ready to go. And then it immediately was canceled because I think, what was it? It was under 200 deaths from the vaccine.
Yeah, well, this is we actually chronicle the history of the swine flu scare. That was 1976 under Gerald Ford, where out of Fort Detrick, some scientists said, "Well, listen, there could be another bad flu strain." There wasn't actually a swine flu problem. They thought it was possible. It's a prediction, so they came up with a vaccine and they tried to vaccinate the whole country. It turns out 25% of the country took this new vaccine for the virus that never came, by the way. And sadly, about 25 people died. About 500 total got what's called Guillain-Barré syndrome or paralysis. Guillain-Barré syndrome, Tommy, is actually, a known side effect of the flu shot. It's in the FDA package insert of the flu shots given today. It was a disaster. No Twitter, no VAERS, just good old common sense. They said, listen, shut it down. This is not safe. Shut it down. Ford administration did the right thing and shut it down. So it's in our book, Tommy, and people who want this kind of factual history, they want to learn about the characters, it's meticulously cited. This book is for them. Vaccines, ideology, mythology, ideology, and reality. And you went to the reality of it, and the reality is vaccines have lowered, the prevalence of some, highly communicable diseases like measles, for example. Chickenpox, another one. There's no doubt the vaccines have had an impact.
And then also, and this is something I didn't know, but the smallpox, or excuse me, not smallpox, polio vaccine, when that came out, I mean, the way it was described was it kind of felt a lot like, COVID. It was people, church bells ringing and they're letting
Mhm.
workers out earlier, and people were putting thank yous up in storefronts, and, local congregations, masses were being held as, a thank you. And then it very quickly went south, paralyzed a ton of people, and it was pulled off. Could you go into that a little more?
Well, we highlight, first off, let me just say there never was a polio pandemic. Never. So even in the worst case, worst year was 1952 before the vaccines rolled out. I think we had a couple thousand deaths. And, there was, several tens of thousands of cases, but it was never millions of kids with polio. Never. And so when the vaccines rolled out, they were initially produced on cultured monkey cells. And they did use a known oncogenic promoter, SV40 or simian virus 40. And additionally, the I'm sorry, let me correct myself. So initially, the it was a live attenuated vaccine. We're talking about the injectable polio vaccine. So it was just the polio virus, and it was grown on cultured monkey cells. But the monkey cells clumped together, and they tried to use formaldehyde to kind of kill the monkey cells and kill the virus. But since they clumped together, it didn't kill all the virus. So some kids got injected with live polio virus. It's called the Cutter incident. It came from a laboratory called Cutter Labs. And then what happened, Tommy, is hundreds of thousands of kids got polio, not tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, and sadly some died. And they had to shut down Cutter Labs. It was a complete disaster. Later on, during the polio campaign, they were contaminated with what's called SV40, and there was an Institute of Medicine report on that. I know, Tommy, because I got one of these. I was in the region where these were distributed as a kid. My mom took me in. I took the polio vaccines. We don't know what the impact is of taking a vaccine that's contaminated with a known proto-oncogene
Bless you.
activator called SV40. But to this day, we do wonder how much cancer in people my age is potentially due to taking the polio vaccine way back when. So the point of all this is none of the vaccines are perfect. In general, the initial vaccines for each disease that come out are not very good. They tend to have safety problems, may not be so effective. And in general, Tommy, they get refined and they get safer.
Realistically, then, what has changed? I believe it's William Markin. I had him on years ago, a former Army Intel guy. He has a great book called "The Generals Have No Clothes," and it's all about mission creep of how it starts as this, and
Mhm.
even or and then there's another book by Professor David Vine, "Base Nation," and it's about how things start as like, well, you have to have this, merge. They'll literally airdrop like bulldozers and sandbags, and if it stays for a while, then it turns into something that they call lily pads, which are really tiny bases, but so you can hop to from bigger bases. And as these things kind of grow and grow and grow, they become fortified, and then they almost become like embassy-like in that they're fortresses. And next thing you know, they start like in cyberdynamics, the whatever a system does is what it's intended to do. It's essentially the unwritten law in cyberdynamics. As these things grow, they start to feed themselves and become self-sustaining. And then it's like, well, if we have this base here, we can do missions from here. We can send drones from here. It grows and grows and grows. And I think the example Art can use is something called JIATIF South. And I don't know what in the world it stands for, but essentially like a mesh between the Navy and the Air Force, entire surveillance and patrolling of the Atlantic Ocean, and it started from as far back as World War II, getting U-boats all the way up to now. It's loosely about stopping terrorism and cartels, and
Mhm.
it grows and grows and grows, and there's a financial incentive, and people get paid, and then the people that get paid go become a senator, and it grows in itself. So my point in saying all of that is it seems like the difference between the 70s and now, so something like that was shut down, and not even with public outcry and public reach of Twitter, Facebook, text messaging. The only reasonable change I can deduce is that the whatever the revolving door is has become it's become moving so fast and intertwined so fast that it's impossible to stop once it's started. I think the
It,
example is
it,
yeah.
it does look that way. Now, we organized the book into this timeline, which is important. So, this first epoch of time is called the Great Prelude, which is the smallpox vaccination. And then that moves into what we consider experimentation and development, Louis Pasteur and others. And then we get into the modern vaccination era, 1947. And then finally, this is what you're referring to, and this is pretty scary. This is John Leake's work, historian and best-selling author, the bioweapons era. And 2004 forward, starting with the congressional act called the BioShield Act, and then 2005, the PrEP Act. We've covered that extensively. And so, alarmingly, the world of vaccines, and we're talking about vaccines, mythology, ideology, and reality. The world of vaccines, which started out as this benevolent uh, approach to improve the health of humanity, to defend us against deadly pathogens, has evolved, Tommy, into what we consider the last 20 years now a biological threat or weapons development countermeasure business. And this biopharmaceutical complex that you and I have talked about, it commands trillions of dollars. It appears at this point in time to have enormous control over governments worldwide. Governments are participating in this. And it was brought to full light with the SARS-CoV-2 outbreak from Wuhan, China, from the Wuhan Institute of Virology, and then this worldwide countermeasures program with largely genetic vaccination. And Tommy, no country in the world so far, 5 years into this, has evaluated safety of the vaccines, has opened the vials of the vaccines to inspect them for quality or purity or contaminants, and no country has considered pulling these off the market.
So then I don't think it's too absurd to assume that. I mean, like you've probably seen those physics demonstrations, right? Where it's like, how do you illustrate space time? You put a bowling ball in the middle of a trampoline, and then all the marbles are the planets surrounding them, and that's what a gravity well is. I mean, at first glance, with like just no emotion, just to look at it seems like this is just a new technological arm that is being hoovered up into the military industrial complex. It's the same players, it's the same machine. This is just the newest tech form of it.
Mm.
It's no
Hmm.
longer, 100,000 soldiers running over the trenches. It seems to be bioweapons, but nonetheless, if you just strip it all weapons, whether it's from futuristic mRNA to, a tank from 1950, if you just if you just remove those and just put weapons as a placeholder, it's kind of all the same thing. It's Congress is told that there's a threat by intelligence agencies, often of whom are also in bed with these corporations and doing, coexisting with their research and funding and grants. And then Congress has to say, oh, there's an issue over here, be it it's terrorism, or be it it's COVID, or be it it's monkeypox, or be it it's the Soviets, and be it it's Vietnam. It's the same thing, just and as it circles the drain, it gets tighter and tighter and tighter, and it's pulling in more and more and more. Even if you look at, Department of Homeland Security's lists of critical infrastructure, I mean, if obviously it was created in 2001, but if you just looked at critical infrastructure from 50 years ago, it's pretty obvious. It was like these military bases in the White House, and then as it branches out more and more, it's the hungry hungry hippos is just grabbing bigger and bigger nodes of resources and power. It's sad, but to me, it's also predictable. Like, well, of course, this gets hoovered up into whatever that nucleus is, that nucleus of control, be it over domestic governments or foreign governments or some combination of all of them. It just seems to be another, like Mercury just kind of turning together. It kind of seems like that's what it is, and it. I really don't know what to think. I mean, I don't know what to think of it.
Well, if it was presented to the country that way, to say, listen, we're working on new ways of, battle ready ways of offense or defense for our country, and this involves potentially vaccines for all the civilians, and this is what we're doing, we could try to fairly evaluate it. But what was presented to us is that there is this virus. Remember, Anthony Fauci and all of our government leaders said this is a virus that came out of nature near Wuhan, China. And now we need to ready ourselves for vaccination. I think it's the deception part of it that's really got so many people angered.
And it seems though as if there is sort of an act of God. What are your thoughts, just being close to it? What are your thoughts on it? Seems like there actually is some pushback. Now, we haven't, unfortunately, have gotten any pushback on the mRNA vaccines, but even something like, Bobby Kennedy recently talking about mercury contaminants. Does it seem like there's any, I mean, is this like a false win? Is this a shimmering illusion? Does it seem like there is some realistic pushback against this behemoth, or is this, I don't know.
Well, the pushback is really coming from the public, from the stuff we're doing, not from any government official. So the work we're doing, careful scholarship, our publications, our podcasts, we're actually up to 60% of expecting mothers and young parents are not going to have their kids take all the vaccines. There's only 40% said you're going to follow the schedule. And the American Academy of Pediatrics, when they saw this report, it came out in JAMA, they went ballistic. And the American Academy of Pediatrics, Tommy, said, listen, every state should take away non-medical exemptions. That basically said, listen, they're going to try to railroad vaccination on every kid in the United States. That's the American Academy of Pediatrics. So we're coming up to an epic battle now between freedom of choice and people understanding that, not all vaccines are safe for all kids. And then these various physician organizations, I'm sure public health agencies will be aligned with them, to say, listen, it doesn't matter. Everybody has to take these. And if some are harmed along the way, they have to do it for the betterment of humanity. That they are essentially following, Tommy, vaccine ideology. This is exactly the ideology. The ideology says, take it for the team. That there's no concerns over safety. If safety problems happen, there's unavoidable harm that's built into the 1986 vaccine law. There's unavoidable harm. So you have to do this for the betterment of society. And that's going to be the struggle that we're going to see play out.
And that argument, for the greater good, when it's made genuinely, it can be backed up genuinely. You look at something like World War II. Yeah, I would imagine that was probably for the greater good. And it sucks there's a draft, but ultimately, yeah, you probably, we lost 400,000 soldiers, 85 million people died worldwide. We kind of got out in pretty good condition, all things related.
Mm.
In the case you look at Korea, which we lost even more soldiers in, but it's called the Forgotten War because no one knows that. We look at Vietnam, and those things, in hindsight, you certainly cannot make the argument that it was for the greater good. There's really no one can really stand on that and look at it and go, yeah, I don't know. Some people might still try to defend GWAT, Global War on Terror, just because it's very recent, but no legitimate person makes an argument about Korea or Vietnam. But you go back further and you look at World War II. So you could say, with this argument I'm making, if you were to poke holes in it, you could say, okay, well, the farther back you go, you say none of it was worth it. Well, no, that's not the case. Look at World War II. Look at the Civil War. Look at the Revolutionary War. A lot of those things you go, yeah, no, that was worth it. That was worth it. But other things, you absolutely cannot. Vietnam, global war on terror. And so my point is even when you send men into a meat grinder, if it genuinely is for the greater good, that argument stands up against the test of time. It doesn't matter if all the videos are in black and white. You look back at it, you look at the geopolitical, the global chessboard, and you go, yeah, that kind of makes sense. They cannot honestly make that argument because if you really did, you would have someone come out and be like, "Hey, I know everybody's skeptical. This is what happens, and it sucks. One out of however many kids get this, but we can see in this third world nation, this is what happens when the people who don't get this vaccine, it kills them all, and it's horrible, and it's a price none of us should pay, but this is what happens." And reasonable people would look at that and they would be reasonable about it. But you don't have that. You just have this dismissive, shut up, sit down. And like you pointed out in your book, and Dr. Ken Albeck's been on here and talked about it with his daughter, you cannot remove parents' experience from having a little baby, a toddler, and they hit all the milestones and everything. You're good. Yeah, it's all right. And then they go and get all these shots, and within days, they are drastically not that they're a little cranky. I mean, they're nonverbal. They spin
Mm.
around in circles. They forget how to walk. Like, and that to me is much like we saw with COVID. That's kind of why I don't have any faith in it. I don't have any faith in it because no one can even attempt to make a genuine. I'm sure someone could get out there if they really wanted to and they had an incentive, they could maybe try to justify Korea. If you really wanted to, you could maybe make an argument for Vietnam. You'd have to be smart and you'd have to be, silver-tongued, but no one even is seemingly attempting to with vaccines. It's just simply it's for the greater good and then shut up. So I think you're right. It kind of does seem to be the clash of titans right now. It's parents versus, the companies that want to just shoot all these kids with all these drugs and hide all of the side effects. And
Well, Tommy, in chapter 19, titled Intrigue in the U.S. Court of Federal Claims, we bring up the case of Dr. Poling. And Dr. Poling is a neurologist at Johns Hopkins, early 1990s. And he has a daughter, turns out to have a genetic predisposition for a neuropsychiatric, neuromuscular problem. And sure enough, she takes the vaccines, the vaccine bundle. And she was 19 months at the time. And she was, normal progression, everything's fine. In fact, Poling publishes her case as a case report. So he's at Johns Hopkins. The title of it was Developmental Regression and Mitochondrial Dysfunction in a Child with Autism. And they describe his child Hannah's case. And within 48 hours of immunizations to diphtheria, tetanus, pertussis, Haemophilus influenza B, measles, mumps, and rubella, polio, and varicella, all together. So it's the battery. She developed fever, inconsolable crying, irritability, lethargy, and refused to walk. 4 days later, the patient was waking up multiple times in the night, having what's called ophthalmos. Her eyes were in this kind of rhythmic movement, and she couldn't walk up the stairs anymore. She developed a rash over the abdomen. For 3 months, she was irritable, and then she developed clear autistic behaviors. So Poling publishes this, and he's part of what's called an omnibus vaccine injury claim situation. His case is pulled out as this example case. And then the bottom line is he's offered a deal. He's offered a settlement. And he takes the settlement. This is sealed. And then, he leaves Johns Hopkins. He's in practice in Athens, Georgia. And let me just read to you here. It says, this is, and John Leake wrote this part, he studied it. The government's concession to Hannah Poling's parents was a means of removing her case from the omnibus autism proceeding so that it would have no bearing on the test cases and the court's decision for the other 5,617 claimants. About a year later, in February 2009, the court ruled that none of the test cases had shown a causal link between vaccines and autism, and therefore they were all denied compensation to the remaining petitioners. So Poling, who's at Johns Hopkins, who has a clear case of vaccine autism, he actually gets a deal. They get him out of the case so he can, because he had the most authoritative case. He's a doctor. He saw this. He's a neurologist. And then they reject all the others. I mean, people have to get this book and read these important historical milestones.
And again, the counter argument is to paint you as anti-vaxxer, not you specifically, the general you as anti-vaxxer, but I mean any rational, emotionally grounded person would just look at this and say, no, like just look at the percentage of autism rates over the last couple decades and just examine it soberly. Don't put your emotions in this or that. It's left or right. Don't put countries on it. Just view it as, I don't know, as if you had a child. And when it seems like pretty undeniably that these cases are going up, something is causing it. And we have these parents with anecdotal evidence, and it's anecdotal, and just examine it. Like that's the rational thing. The fact that even that is being shut down, like I'm willing to hear out the arguments for and against, but the fact that that very argument itself is being shut down, to me is kind of like, hand in the cookie jar. I'm like, well, that's pretty obvious then. If they're shutting it down and they have this huge financial incentive for that not to happening, then I would imagine somewhere that there's some internal polling or internal studies that goes, yeah, this is probably 100% caused by or causing it.
Well, Tommy, it's the absence of an alternative explanation. So, for instance, people say, well, it's not the vaccines that are, risk factor for autism. It's eating Fruit Loops. So therefore, we're going to ban Fruit Loops and everything's going to get better. There is no other alternative explanation being put forward. And so I use the word risk factor instead of cause because the first case of autism we could find actually was before even any vaccines were developed. So it clearly can happen on its own. It seems to be tightly linked to febrile seizures of any cause. A paper by Nielsen and colleagues found among children who develop febrile seizures, by the way, it's about 4% of U.S. children develop a febrile seizure every year. There's about a 40% conversion rate to some neurologic problem. So attention deficit disorder, autism spectrum disorder, tics, seizures. So this having a seizure after getting a bunch of shots in a 1-year-old baby, just like Dr. Poling's 19-month-old child, is a disaster. And as a parent, you want to avoid it. I think a lot of parents now are terrified, Tommy, and they're declining all vaccines. And the published studies of children over the last several decades who get no vaccines whatsoever show that they're very healthy. They're perfectly fine.
And sorry, there's a fire truck going by. Yeah, and that's the other thing is you're not against all the vaccines at all. Like, so what do you think it is? Do you think it's all of them in totality, or do you think it is the I guess bandwidth, the rate of getting them all in one day? If you had to take a wild guess.
Yeah, I think it's compound safety, giving them all together because people have studied, which ones have aluminum, which ones have mercury. They've largely gotten mercury out, and there's all this debate over aluminum. But I mean, you can just read what this poor girl got before she converted to autism. This isn't a published case. This is not, this is not speculation. This is published in the peer-reviewed literature. I mean, listen to what she gets, Tommy. Diphtheria, tetanus, pertussis, Haemophilus influenza B, measles, mumps, and rubella, polio, and varicella or chickenpox, all together. If I gave that many medicines all together, I promise you, someone would have a side effect. I just finished with a patient in the office. I prescribed one medicine. One, not 12. One. I mean, vaccinology, Tommy, is like a delusional religious belief that if one is good, that more is better. And there's just kind of keep giving more and more. Do you know the World Health Organization has a program called, I think it's Health 2020, where they aspire to advance 500 vaccines on people. 500.
What?
Yeah, 500. This is astonishing. Do you know the number of vaccines for pets now is skyrocketing? It's the same thing. So it's not just humans. This field of vaccinology it's like an unhinged delusional belief system that these are like a religious talisman that this is going to give you good luck and just keep giving more and more and more.
And it's probably not the best analogy, but I mean, just for the sake of it, it'd be like climate change. I don't think anyone is denying the charts that show a temperature is going up. I think most people would go, yeah, it's probably happening. All of the battle comes, it's from solar cycles, or it's glacial cycles, or it's industrialization, or it's agriculture, or it's poultry and meat, whatever it is. Even that, it's still based in that everyone sees a graph and agrees on the numbers. Now, what it's caused by, human or not, natural or not, cyclical or not, that's when all the rabid fighting starts.
Mhm.
But there's no denial of it. You look at it, and some people say there's nothing we can do, so why limit our GDP? Whatever. It's not the point of this show. With autism, it's we all look at it, and then it's not that there are these compounding arguments of it's vaccines. Well, no, it's from it's from cell phones, and there's more, electromagnetic radiation. No, there's a side of putting forward a theory, and then there's a side of no, absolutely not. I mean, it's kind of a big red arrow pointing at someone. Like, well, it kind of seems like that's it.
Well, I gave the kind of keynote at the National Autism Summit this year, and I put together basically a presentation about risk factors. So there are some common genetic variants associated. Older parents, a woman over 35, man over 40 conceiving, and then premature delivery, delivering before 37 weeks. Those are the risk factors besides compound vaccination, which is the big one out there. But just to highlight what I said about this delusional, irrational exuberance over vaccines, this is from the World Health Organization Agenda 2030. The immunization agenda aims, and I'm reading this right off their advertorial, they want to reduce by 50% the number of children missing out on all vaccines, achieve 90% coverage for essential vaccines given in childhood and adolescence, and they want to introduce, Tommy, 500 new vaccines in low and middle income countries. I
Five.
mean, why not 5,000? I mean, like I say, it's an irrational exuberance. It's just, we have to kind of rein this in. It's pretty clear it's getting out of control. And the same is true for our pets. The same is true for the pets. Now there's great concern that, seizures in dogs, for instance, could be related to compound vaccination. Like, why would they be? Potential other behavioral disturbances. Let's take dogs or cats as an example. What about cancer? This is very interesting. When a wolf dies out in the wild, to my knowledge, if the body's ever, autopsy, there's no cancer. But I can tell you, dogs, a huge proportion of canine death is due to cancer. It's something about domestication. Maybe it's food or other things. But anyhow, Tommy, we're
I,
going to need to draw to the
yeah,
close.
I know I
But
gotta
thank
let.
you so much for featuring the book. I hope everybody can get it. If there's anybody has any doubts about this connection between vaccination and autism, they have to read about Dr. Poling, Jonathan Poling, who published the case of his daughter clearly developing autism after getting a big battery of vaccines, and how the government cut a deal with him to get his case
Yeah.
out of the omnibus, and then they sank all the rest of the cases. The poor parents didn't have a chance.
We'll pin it there, and everybody can go to the link in the description to get the book and follow them on Twitter, your Substack, the Wellness Company. I was gonna say the last thought was it feels like it's the last 10 years of the Cold War, where all the defense contractors kind of knew it was the end, and Reagan really opened up the money bag, and they all just got a shovel. I hope that's what it is, because that ends somewhat benignly. I,
Yeah, let's
I don't
hope.
know.
There's
I
got
don't
to
know.
be some shoe that's going to fall next, Tommy. Thank you so
Yes,
much
sir.
for having me on the program. I'm Dr. Peter McCullough. Tommy Carrigan, make sure you follow him. He's the best.
Thank you, Dr. McCullough. I love you so much. Thank you for
All
coming
right.
on here. Guys, go to the description, grab his book, Substack, Twitter, Wellness Company, all that good stuff. Dr. McCullough, thank you.